people said, oh, Wandsworth Common doesn't have a history. It's just a load of, maybe a few sheep, because there were sheep put on the common in the 1920s.
Well, it was the nearest open space to us, quite honestly. And of course, having come from the country, I thought it was very funny that there was no sort of open spaces like we got there.
It was more trees and untidy and things in those days, you know. And suddenly, over the years, it looks immaculate.
The more you study the history of Wandsworth Common and the people around it, the more extraordinary, you know, the nature of its grass, the nature of its smoothness, its trees.
Oh, I had no idea of the history until I joined the Friends of Wandsworth Common. Learnt a lot.
That's just memories, lovely memories, actually. I've been so lucky to be able to live here forever, it seems.
The London County Council, when it took over towards the end of the 19th century, flattened everything. They wanted to make sports fields, but they also wanted to make straight or relatively straight paths, tarmac them. There was never any money when the Conservators took over after 1871, and they wanted to keep it wild.
And when that was succeeded by the GLC, which was, within that timescale, relatively short-lived, Margaret Thatcher then ditched the GLC in 1986, and the ownership of the common was handed to Wandsworth Council.
And there wasn't a balance for what the users wanted to be able to do on the common. You need to balance the activities, be they formal or informal. You want to balance people being very quiet and wandering around, lying on their backs and looking at the sky. You want to re-engage with nature. None of this was happening.
Pond, of course, is completely different. We called it the pond, it's now called the lake. It's completely different from how it was in the 1950s, early 1960s, in that it had been for 100 years. All of the banks were smooth and dry and just sandy and gravelly. There were almost no trees or bushes or anything around. It looks, to my eyes, infinitely more interesting and beautiful now.
It seemed to be a much more informal place then. The sides had not been built up. I suppose it's safer now, but I don't ever remember anybody falling in the pond. The wooden boards were not there. No, it was much more informal.
The pond was big. It used to give out canoes. I was on a bike. Pedalers. That thing. They had a shop there. Well, they had a shed with all these things in, and people could hire them to the kids and use them for an hour.
I think back then it was a slightly less attractive area. I think they've done quite a lot of work in subsequent years. I think the one thing was that they dredged it, and after the dredging, they improved the landscape to the whole thing, and it was beautifully done.
And then the council decided the easy thing to do was to block it off, let trees and shrubs grow on the end bit, and leave the pond that much smaller.
Wandsworth Common was run more as a park than a common, and it was run for the sake of what I would describe as the vociferous users, the football clubs particularly, and they came from right across South London, and they had no local interest. All they wanted was that their football pitches should be usable, which was sometimes just a pious hope, because of course Wandsworth Common actually historically was not farmland, was not used for much else because it was prone to flooding.
So they built this almost like an underground railway underneath the common. There's a shaft in Wandsworth Common station, and there's a shaft down near the Thames, and they built this tunnel which is quite a size, and it was called the Falconbrook Relief Sewer, and it takes that excessive surface water down to the River Thames.
It was probably 1920s that the whole area, the far end, that's the Burntwood Lane end, was covered in clinker, probably from Lots Road Power Station or one of the local power stations, and that was used as a football pitch because the rest of the common was so wet.
And I remember the cinder patch. They played football after the war. I think that was up, sort of backing on almost to Burntwood Lane, Trinity Road, that sort of triangle there. That's all overgrown now.
So the scope, you mean?
The scope, yes,
yeah.
yes. And that was called the cinder patch. We knew it as the cinder patch. I think it still is remembered as the cinder patch. And football was played there. So I used to go sometimes on a Saturday morning with my father.
We used to play Cowboys and Indians over there. And I remember there's a wood merchant in Northcote Road, which is now the Antique Centre, just more the library, but that was a wood yard, and we used to go in there and buy a tuppenny piece of wood and make a bow out of it, and bamboo arrows, and we used to go bushy common playing Cowboys and Indians. That was probably the wildest part of the common.
When we went out to play on the street, it was always Cowboys and Indians and bows and arrows, things like that. So that's me outside 7 Belleville Road.
We didn't need anything because it was just running around without parents around. But also we played games in the street.
When you've got narrow horizons when you're a 5-6-year-old, we were very much sort of like Belleville Road, that bit of the common was our world, and we didn't dare stray from it. So we rarely went to the playground.
I actually began to live here in Baskerville Road, not this house, but number 13. Must have been 90s. It was the year that steam ended coming into Waterloo, so it was 67, 68.
And then when my uncle, her youngest son, got married, his wife, because I think she was just about 19 at the time, they had a couple of rooms upstairs, so we sort of all squashed in together.
There were big houses that people had left or left during the war, evacuated, whatever, and it was easy to make them into flats.
We just managed. We had a toilet in the bathroom and a toilet on the first floor up.
And it was also slightly run down, but there was a certain charm there, I think. But if you wanted a taxi from Chelsea to Wandsworth Common, you wouldn't get one.
Tilehurst Road was built in the 1930s. The houses were beautifully built, but there was a great divide because there were the privately built houses. I think there were probably holloways as well, as this one is. But the houses on the opposite side of the road were developed as council housing.
My father was a prison officer, and so I lived in 3 or 4 houses that were actually part of the prison estate. So behind the prison there's another world. It's like I used to think of it as an urban village. Absolutely everybody who lived there was connected directly to the prison, nearly always.
When we first moved into the area, into Garrett Lane, we paid 30 shillings a week for our rent, which was wonderful. It slightly went up when we moved up to Ellerton Road.
I'm not quite so sure if it was quite so posh then as it is now. Probably being on the common, on the side of the common. But very soon, I think when I was about 1, a house came up for sale in Fruin Road, and my grandfather, who had the money then, rather than my parents, paid, and I've been trying to find out. I remember it was something like £360 to buy number 21 at Fruin Road.
When there was remnants of old Wandsworth and Battersea living here, it was the odd plumber and the odd tradesman, and they all had their funny ways of doing things, and the houses were sometimes a bit higgledy-piggledy.
Compared to now, it was very much a working class, respectable working class community. The bloke who lived next door was a postman, I remember. Our friend over the road, John, his mother didn't work, his father was a police officer. So it was very much certainly not middle class, certainly not upper middle class, which is what it seems to be like now.
Well, I think after the war, people, my dad wanting to marry my mum and what they're going to do to live. I think it was to do with a good friend of his in the RAF, whose brother had bought this house in Belleville Road. And I can still remember it so clearly. They built a wall. So we lived in the upper part, but it was we thought we were very poor, but it was 3 bedrooms with a toilet and a bathroom and a kitchen.
After school, we would just go out to play until dusk. I remember sort of playing on the street outside, and, when it was getting dark, your mum would call you in for tea, come on kids, come in, tea's ready, sort of thing, and it's getting dark, it's 7 o'clock, time for bed.
So I remember I had a big bedroom, but my mother would come with the washing, and there was one of these trolley over the garden, like a trolley thing.
A pulley
thing.
System, yes.
And she'd come in to dry the washing there. And so Wandsworth Common was our garden.
The fact that we were allowed to walk around Bellevue Road, Northcote Road, over the Common, as long as you were with a friend and you told your parents where you were, they didn't really mind that much. And off we went on our bikes.
We used to cycle round the houses here and the Common, and I remember the Common keepers. They were always dressed in brown and had a brown trilby, brown coat, and they used to walk around the Common, just make sure that everyone was fine.
But these Common keepers, they were real tyrants. I think they were sort of ex-army people, and they seemed to delight in making our lives
misery.
They were. Thing that if you're on a bike, there was a rule about cycling that you could only cycle on the Common if your wheels were within a certain radius, and just to stop adults. It was only had to be children's bikes. But if a child had a bike that was vaguely had big wheels, they'd be there with their measure. You can't ride that on the Common, it's too big.
They had this lovely uniform on. It was a sort of khaki coloured, and it looked a bit like that, you see, with this sort of dark green stripe, long trousers and a flat hat, of course, like this. And fairly young, sort of 30 to 40-year-olds, I suppose. And anything you wanted on, where's the ladies' loo? Sort of things like that, and they'd point you in the direction, or where's this or where's that. They were lovely. They were on bicycles.
They wore a brown uniform with a brown Tilby hat, and they all carried a stick with a spike on the end and a sack. And every bit of rubbish was spiked up, put in the sack. And also, they shouted at us if we climbed trees. They shouted at the boys if they were caught paddling in the pond. But on the other hand, I think if you were in trouble, they would help you.
When Loxley comes onto the Common, at the end of the toast rack, there used to be a small bandstand there. It wasn't huge, it was about 15, 20 foot across. Nobody's got any records of it. But
we've looked for it on maps.
My sister, who's 6 years older than me, and I used to go around with her and her gangs. I was much to time, and we found one of the panels in this bandstand was loose, and we actually built a little hide in there until one of the brown Common keepers caught us. And it's the first time I think I was really scared. I was only about 5 or 6, I think. And he really shouted at us, and he marched us off to his office, which was one of the buildings at the back of the Skylark Cafe. And he got us in there and he said, I'm going to call the police, I'm going to call your parents. And I remember at the time being really terrified of this.
I don't recollect ever seeing any parkies on the scope, which is probably why It was our preferred area for just having fun, because you could climb trees there, you could engage in all sorts of camp building and what have you. But remember, the scope was very different then. Today, it's rather lovely, it's rather wonderful, but it's got huge numbers of trees on it, obviously, and bushes. But then it was much wetter. It was always wet all the year round, covered in Molinia grass, that purple moor grass, and furze bushes and some brambles, but very, very few trees, almost no trees.
You would knock on all your friends, knock on all your door. Are you coming up the common? Or coming up the swings? And a group of about 6 or 7 of your friends would all go up the common together.
Well, Northcote Road, we used to walk across there because I think there was Bolingbroke Hospital, and I remember going to the swings over that part of the common that's going over the bridge. There was a swing area which, my brother was there one day, and I remember going, and he told me to wait outside this wrought iron sort of, it was partitioned off. It was a very big swing that, anyway, I didn't do as I was told, and I did walk towards him, and the swing came back and caught me here on the forehead, and I don't remember anymore. And the next thing, I was in Bolingbroke Hospital, and apparently my brother had to run all the way home to get my mum because I had to have stitches.
I mean, as Phil said, the go-to place was the swings, but it was quite a walk for us to get.
So dangerous, the swings in those days. There was a huge, great big high slide, and no
soft landing.
No soft landing. If you fell off, you hurt yourself.
There was a sand pit there that was nearly always closed because there was a lot of polio, as you know, in the 1950s.
All the children that were my age, or round about my age, or my brother's age, because he was 2 years older than me, we all were friends. And we used to go on the common together, and in the Fitzhugh estate they had a social club, so when you were sort of 11, 12, 13, you would go to the social club that used to be open once or twice a week.
The post-war baby bulge, which we all know about, the boomers, meant that there were enormous numbers of children growing up around the prison where I was. Enormous numbers of children, and playing around. We would try it. It was quite tribal. Tribes were everywhere, and the same was true of Fitzhugh, because all those houses were filled with, so far as I know, so far as I remember, with young families.
My understanding is that the target group were young professionals, so nurses, teachers, doctors, whatever, and they were all young families. And of course today we have got 3, 4 people that I know who've lived here ever since this building opened, and they came here with their young families.
So that was the 1950s, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was 1953.
What I do remember, though, is, so we used to wander around those sort of little hills and play our little games and make up games. And if you walk along, you come to that bridge, Cat's
Back Bridge.
Cat's Back Bridge. But in those days, it had a little fence. So, I mean, we used to stand on the top of that bridge.
Because as the train went through, you were enveloped in this cloud of steam and smoke, and it was, I know it sounds a bit pathetic, but it was, we found it exciting because you...
It's a wonderful smell, wasn't it?
And you couldn't see in either direction for the... I'm sure we got filthy doing it.
When my son was born in 1956, 56, I lived right opposite the common, so every morning we'd dust the pram off and off we'd go with a bag of bread and bits and pieces. He loved feeding the birds, he loved going over the little bridge and dropping, and then we'd go off to the railway station or the line and watch the trains come and the trains go.
I showed them these pictures on Sunday when they looked in, and they both remember steam trains. And this was something what we all loved to do, was stare through the railings.
Robin Gisby organised for the pupils at Beatrix Potter and St Mary's schools to find out about the evacuation of children for the war. And he arranged, using his Network Rail contacts, for a special train to take them down to where the children from those schools were evacuated to.
We met at Magdalen Road, which then was Beatrix Potter, and any evacuees at the time, we were going back down to a reunion, so we went across to Wandsworth Common station, and there was Huffington, and suddenly this train came in, and it was just like I was being evacuated again.
And Wandsworth Common station was paraded with youngsters with gas masks, and the policemen in traditional uniform, and a very ancient Wolsey car, which the police used in those days.
And I kept saying, the school was there. No, the school's down the road. And then somebody came up and said, Mrs. Jones is right, the school was there. It was one of the big houses that had turned into a school. And we used to go on the common and play silly little games.
Well, when war broke out, I was at Furcroft School, and of course that closed. And we had a little lady who lived round the corner in Broderick Road who opened a school for the children who were not evacuated. And my brother Alan and I went there, but because I was older than Alan, I went in the morning and he went in the afternoon. But then when the bombing started, she had to close it because she couldn't take the risk of having children there.
Well, I was born in Broomwood Road, lovely one of those big double-fronted houses, and when I was 6, my parents decided to sell it because there was the V1 bomb just across the road. They bought it actually during the war, and there was a lot of bomb damage on that house, and I think they were frightened it was going to fall down.
The searchlights are in position. The guns are ready. The People's Army of Volunteers is ready. They are the ones who are really fighting this war. And there's the wail of the Banshee. The nightly siege of London has begun. The city is dressed for battle.
Woke up in the morning. I lived in this side of the fields, and that was field view. There was a hole, and the last one ended up in the cemetery. Now, my naughty first brother, my youngest brother, but he was older than me, loved going around on his bike picking up shrapnel, or if there was a hanging at Wandsworth Prison, he'd be there, sort of thing. And he came home once with a bone, and my father looked at him and said, "Where did you get that from?" He said, "Well, take it back," he said.
You found that in the cemetery, I
Yes,
suppose.
he found it. He found the hole, and it had blasted its way out,
Yes.
probably into Magdalen Road. But that's what it did. So little things like that suddenly come. You think, "Oh my goodness, oh dear, this is war, isn't it?"
I mean, I remember the bombing quite well. I remember the doodlebugs, the V1s and the V2s coming over. I remember various houses being bombed in the locality.
There was the one in the back of us, but it didn't explode. That's why I ended up in a prefab on Wandsworth Common there for a little while, because we couldn't get into the house. And I think it was all right in the front. We just couldn't live in there.
They had anti-aircraft guns on Trinity Fields, which in those days was the old boys of Sir Walter St John's School and Battersea Grammar, had half of it each. And they also had some on the part of the common between Trinity Road and Lyford Road. No, it's not Lyford Road anymore. They changed it to Sandgate Lane.
Exactly. What happened was the sirens went and the bomb dropped, and all the glass of the window blew in and it covered the cot. And when my mum came up to the room, I was still fast asleep, but covered in glass on this eiderdown that we had on me, to keep me warm.
Quite a lot of bombing here. I mean, when I lived in Openview, we had to move to Putney because we lost the back of our house anyway, and 2 people were killed in the house next door. It was a doodlebug. It wasn't one of the bombs, so it was a bit later in the. But they moved us to a fabulous house in Richmond Park. 5 bathrooms, 7 bedrooms, but 3 other families.
Well, my dad was the grocer.
Yes.
He did the provisions. We had a cellar downstairs, which we used during the war. My mum, she papered all the walls and pictures, and we had beds down there.
The siren used to go on the police station down in Trinity Road, and then we would take shelter. In our front room we had a Morrison shelter, which was a large steel frame, and as children we played table tennis on top of it.
I remember ration books, and yes, very much, and going, yes, and my mother presenting the ration book, particularly at the Co-op. That's where she did most of her shopping, in Bellevue Road at the Co-op, which is now which has been various wine bars ever since.
Well, yes, everybody had to bring their ration book. And you used to cut out the tea curtains, coupons which were fair, because you had to cut them out and then thread them all up in hundreds, and so they couldn't get tea unless they got the right number of coupons.
And of course, during the war, we had one egg every fortnight. Scrambled egg was, I loved scrambled egg. The powdered stuff, they mixed it up with a bit of milk and threw it in the pan. Mind you, I ate anything and everything when I was a child. Well, you had to, because otherwise you didn't get it, you know.
Well, I don't think as children we thought of the dangers. I think it was adults that thought of the dangers. To us, to some degree, to us, it was I suppose, a bit of an adventure, really.
Yes. We played in what we called bomb sites, which would, there were sort of houses and then there'd be a gap where presumably a bomb hit, and it was still just rubble, just huge pile of rubble and pipes, and it must, incredibly dangerous it must have been. And these days it would all be fenced off, but the funny thing was, we were sort of not really aware of the war. We certainly called it a bomb. Let's go and play on the bomb site, but I didn't really understand what a bomb site meant or what a bomb was.
There's no sign of it now, of course, but there was a bomb crater right almost on the edge of the scope, backing onto Lyford Road. A big bomb crater, and of course one side there was all the way around, wonderful slope right down into the... So we had great fun. I say we, I don't remember who I slid with, but it must have been one of my friends.
It's terrifying, actually, when you think about it, where children would say, oh, well, let's go and play down the bomb damage. And you weren't stopped. I don't remember, you'd go out and play all day, and nobody would worry about where you were.
Down Bellevue Road, there were 2 rows of prefabs built, which were basically factory-built houses that came as a kit to put together and were put on a concrete base. And then when you got to Bolingbroke Grove, there were 2 more rows along by the road. And they disappeared very quickly after the war when they built the Fitzhugh estate.
I have a vague memory of these prefabs all the way along the edge of the common. There must have been 20, 30, 40 all the way along, because you used to have to walk past them to get onto the common.
Yes.
And my mother sort of told me later that they were built, prefabricated after the war to house people who'd been bombed out in the war and also returning servicemen.
My father was in the RAF. I think there was priority given to service people to move into prefabs, because I think there was a huge demand at the time.
My brother was ill a lot. He had a lot of chest and coughs and whatever, and the doctor said he would help them find a place that was more suitable, a council house. And so he helped them get the prefab when he was just a few months old, and I think they went in new.
Of course, the wonderful thing was that you had a garden. You had a garden all the way around. And, one of the memories that I have is the smell of tomatoes growing, because people grew their own vegetables. So we had, what was then... you wouldn't squeeze 4 people in that space now just with one bathroom, would you? People expect a bathroom each.
Quite a big building for me. I was there from 0 to 7, so to me it seemed quite spacious because we had a kitchen, a lounge, 2 bedrooms, a separate toilet and a bathroom.
I have really strong memories of living there because there was such a community. I think there were probably, I'm trying to think, 4, 6, 7, probably 10 or 11 prefabs on that particular site, right next to the St Mark's Church.
I can't think of one negative thing for me. From 0 to 7, when we left, I was quite sad to leave. Because everybody was lovely.
I mean, for instance, you had a school teacher, a taxi driver, somebody working in publishing, and everybody thought my father was a sort of a round peg in a square hole, because he used to correct the way everybody spoke, and yet he was going off on his bike every day to paint and decorate people's homes.
We used to go to the shops a lot in Wandsworth High Street. By the way, I think we walked everywhere. I hardly remember getting on a bus. We just walked because that was what we did.
I do remember going out on a Saturday afternoon with my mother and father along Northcote Road to buy shopping.
So we regularly walked or drove down Northcote Road. Certainly on a Saturday morning, we would go down to where Ardington Hobbs was, where Lavender Hill goes up, that big sort of crossroads there, to the bank, because unless you got to the bank by 12 noon on a Saturday, when it closed, you had no money for the rest of the week.
You know, lots and lots of shops in the road, and then what I do remember is a fish shop, there was all fresh fish in there, eels in water and stuff like that, and the DeMarco ice cream shop. Does anybody remember that?
Not heard of that.
Oh, because it was so memorable. You know, Italian, you know, from a different country, and lovely ice cream. And I just remember really those two.
And we used to have a Knickerbocker Glory in DeMarco's, which we absolutely loved. And yes, that was a sort of a thing that that I remember that was quite special, you know, to have it. And my dad used to have a banana split, and Ryan and I used to have these enormous Knickerbocker Glories, which were so lovely. And the ice cream was delicious, absolutely delicious.
And they would have just have been butchers, bakers, candlestick makers type of stuff. Walking there today, it's, you know, upper class bistros, wine bars, Italian delicatessens and things like that, upmarket pubs and so on. I mean, it's absolutely nothing like it was.
There used to be a really lively market in the Northcote, which I used to trundle to. But Bellevue had 3 butchers at one time, and a fish shop, United Dairies, a bank.
There was a lovely clock shop by the Surrey Tavern bus stop called Sherard's, and he had some wonderful, wonderful clocks in the window. So while you were waiting for a bus, you could watch his clocks.
Yes. But we didn't have Shays Bruce then, but that was one of the butcher's shops, I'm pretty certain.
He was a butcher in what is now, Shea Bruce restaurant.
Shea Bruce.
And at the back, in the little alleyway that goes round there, he had a slaughterhouse, which I don't remember him using, but he did have grazing rights for sheep on Wandsworth Common. And when people started arguing he didn't, he borrowed some sheep and kept them up there for one night on Wandsworth Common. It was about 6 sheep he had.
We had a haberdashery, which I loved. You could buy wool, because I was a great knitter in those days, and anything like that you could buy and knit. And there was a sort of a fresh fish shop, lovely post office.
And I can remember my father still collected his pension at that post office when I was in my teens. I think it became a bookshop after that, and then it was a jeweller's. And I'm not sure what probably a cafe now, probably a coffee bar now.
But we didn't have Indian or curries or anything like that at all. We had we never had a coffee shop. We never. But nowadays it's houses houses, coffee all the way down the road.
But luckily the skyline hasn't changed. When you're on the Common and you look towards Bellevue Road, there still is that lovely skyline, which I've got many photographs of.
So I remember going round to the County Arms with my mum, and she used to go to Haddock's, the grocery shop where they used to sell. I used to always think of it like Ardin and Hobbs, but it was a lovely old-fashioned shop. You could smell the wood. And
Is that on Trinity Road?
Yes, that's
itself?
right on the corner opposite the County Arms. It was right on that corner there, and it was a lovely, lovely shop. And, you know, everything was fresh, and, you know, they used to cut the cheese off for you. There wasn't any pre-packed, like, food. I remember that.
I worked in the grocers there, and my job, other than stacking bottles and stacking and so on, was to ride a sit-up and beg butcher's bicycle around all these streets where the more affluent people would have placed an order. They didn't go shopping as much, or they would just place an order with Mr. Haddock, and Mr. Haddock would fulfil the order, the boxes, and then I would take the bicycle around.
This is a photo of Trinity Road with the grocer's shop right on the far right-hand side. You can just see the word Tees in the window. And my granddad's bicycle that he used to do the deliveries in the road, and St Mary Magdalene's Church at the other end.
But the main thing I remember is the rag and bone man walking up the street with his horse.
Yes.
With a sort of thing over the horse's mouth with hay in, and he used to sort of let us feed the horse by putting the hay in. And you used to hear rag and bone, and he sort of came up the hill collecting old bits of metal and
junk,
junk basically. Yeah.
The horse stopped in the middle of the road, more or less outside my house, and it was which I think was United Dairies, and it was out. So, and the horse did his number twos, right in the middle of the road. My mother rushed out with a brush and shovel, a shovel and a bucket, and at the same time, one of the neighbours from the other side of the road rushed out also with the same, and I think it's one of the very few times I've seen my mother shout at anybody. She was the most good-natured person ever, and she shouted at this. She was really cross. That's not yours. You don't have the United Dairies. You have an Express Dairy or something. That was not her fertiliser.
Oh, she wanted it for the garden,
She did.
That is outside our house on 7 Belleville Road. It was very unusual to see a car, so we would play out on the street every sort of quarter of an hour or so. You might have to sort of step back to let a car pass. I think because my father was a bit of a mechanic, he had this very old car. He probably bought it second-hand. It's very unusual. Even more unusual was that he taught my mother to drive, and she told me that it was incredibly unusual for a woman to drive. She had funny looks when she was seen driving along in this car.
Got a licence at 14.
That was quite a responsibility for a young person.
I think that's what was. There was nothing on the road really. It was really nothing. And I used to go up at 6 o'clock to Covent Garden to get through, and there was nothing, nobody around at all. I never saw any other traffic at all.
Well, the biggest changes I've seen have been down in Garrett Lane. That has changed vastly. You wouldn't have in 1956 imagined that people would be sitting outside on little chairs drinking coffee. I mean, that was a really a real old place with tram lines.
But you get a trolley bus if you wanted to go to the cinema at Tooting, get up for a penny. And we used to get, the fog was yellow, it was yellow. And the trolley could say used to get the people out just to stand behind the trolley bus and just don't push it because the electrics still work, but stay together sort of thing. Thick fogs that we had. I don't know, where have they gone?
I think the last smog I remember when I was at Croydon Tech, and they knew the smog was coming, and they said, right, they closed the college. Everybody, right, go home. This is about lunchtime. And sure enough, about 3:30, you just couldn't see anything. And that's the last smog I remember. That would have been about 63, 64.
Yeah. I mean, I did what they say you do in a bad fog, just went round in circles. And I don't remember how I got home, but nobody came to collect me, and I'm sure I wasn't sort of taken off by a stranger and taken home. I must have eventually got home. But I remember that sense of just... I wasn't nearly as panicky as I would be now. I'd be terrified now. I just remember that I kept coming back to the same place, which was the path, by the public toilets. Yes, it was. It was round about there. Public toilets on Wandsworth Common.
Across to from Routh to the Catsback Bridge, all of the wooded area to the left-hand side concealed a public lavatory, and of course it meant that people were really alarmed to go in there because they never knew who they might meet, because there was always a lot of discussion about perverts. I don't know if that was the word that we used, but anyway, there was always an anxiety.
And sometimes you used to get these sort of men, what they call flashers, coming along, and but you could go to the common keeper all the time, so he would come up and see that you were okay, if you were playing on your own, and where your parents were. There were some quite notorious murders on the common. I had a friend a year or two older than me who claimed that he had discovered a body which he called it became a sort of famous story among the children, called the lady with the red shoes. I now realise from reading that it wasn't just red shoes, there was a lot of red involved.
When I lived with him at Lyford Road, I'd take the pram down for a walk, and I looked to my right and there was a naked lady. It turned out that she was a prostitute and she'd been... So by the time I got to the butcher said to me, "Hello, Mrs. Jones, I hear you found a body on the common this morning." So I said, "Oh dear." And of course I had the police around it. I didn't.
And everything has changed so much, really. In fact, driving here today, lots of street names I recognised, but everything has changed. Everything has moved on, and it's. I suppose you have to accept that, really, don't you?
It's slightly better looked after, and the trees have grown. Generally, I mean, some along the railway, for example, the trees have gone. It's quite dramatic if you compare photographs.
Well, no, there was nothing for the little ones, like I think I've already said. But there was the bowling green, which my husband, I think, got his eye on from then. And the bowling green was beautifully kept. The green was really lovely, flower beds all around. And he later did join the bowling club and had a few years there.
And you say he was very fond of the green?
Yes, he was. In fact, he said he'd like his ashes to be put there, which I did. So, and that was a bit traumatic, because I went up there with his ashes and sat on a seat, and it was a freezing cold day in March, and there was somebody was there, actually the gardener was there, fiddling about, and he wouldn't go away. And I hadn't asked for permission to spread his ashes, because I thought, well, if I ask permission, they're going to say no, I'm sure. So much better, and I certainly wasn't going to let my husband down. So I had to wait for ages for this groundsman to sort of wander away, which he did eventually. And in the end, I took a chance, and I put his ashes where I thought he'd like them to be. And I had just finished doing that when the chap came back round the corner, and he said, What's all that all over the green? So I said, "Oh, it's my husband's ashes." "Oh," he said, "oh." And then he wandered off. So I didn't get into trouble.
That used to be lovely around the bowling green. I mean, there's lots of shrubs there now, but it was beautifully kept in those days. And lovely flowers all around. But you weren't even allowed to walk around that without being accompanied by an adult. And you had to be 15.
Now you see children playing on the sacred turf, which I just find completely bizarre. I'm horrified. So I have somehow or other imbibed all of the restrictions and restraints.
In the area with Magdalen Park, we've got Heathfield, we've got Wanderley down the road. We've got 5 or 6 bowling greens. I mean, the grass has been there for 100 years.
But the cricket pitches, there were 3, I think. Grass always kept very, very, very close shorn. All the way round was a high fence. Some, I don't know, iron or steel. It must have been iron because it rusted terribly. And it had very pointed tops. And it was really saying to people, nobody is allowed in this area. Obviously, no dogs, no children were allowed unless they were playing a formally recognised game of cricket.
But my father, he started a cricket club in 1945 when he came down from Yorkshire. It was actually my mother's brother and he started this cricket club, which they called Baskerville Cricket Club. And their badge was the Hound of the Baskervilles. And my mum used to embroider these in red on the blazers for them. And they said that other people would complain when they came to play cricket that the ground was too bumpy, and they put it down to the fact that it had been allotments during the war. But so we would often go in that enclosure because our dad was playing cricket there. I think probably otherwise we wouldn't have been allowed in. Growing up here in this area, we've been very lucky, and I think to have the common has been absolutely special to all the families and still is.
Generations.
So popular. I mean, it would be awful if you didn't have that common.
Yeah.
Since having this flat and living in it, I've, developed community from, well, the estate, but also friends of Wandsworth Common and other groups that I'm involved with in Wandsworth. So it's become, a really great place to live for me on a personal level.
I'm so happy, looking back in the historical record, to see that local people worked so hard to secure what remained and enlarge it. So the common is larger now than it was in 1871.
But the really important thing was transforming the common from an open space into something that was a fully balanced place for biodiversity and ecology, and by establishing that, you then got a very, very attractive area.
Looking at ecology, looking at nature, looking at what people want and getting that balance and enhancing, always moving towards enhancing the environment. And the other thing is engaging with the wider public and education.
Probably the significance of having a common close by was the fact that you actually didn't go on holiday, or you didn't go on holiday that much.
And people say, oh, how can you live in London? It's so crowded. But because we're very lucky here, aren't we, between the commons, that, we have got all that lovely green space that, a lot of city people don't have.
With the children and for myself getting older, it has been wonderful. Not going to be easy to move from here because, I've got friends and all the amenities I need, very accessible, and the common. Yes.
Wandsworth Common has always been romantic, because not romantic in a sexy sort of way, but romantic because it's pretty and it's lovely and it's still there, and don't anybody ever do anything with it.